Good morning to one and all present here. I, Yogeshwari,
And I, Srishti.
welcome you all to the fourth webinar under the technical exhibition of Mindspark 21, one of India's most coveted technical festivals. Welcome to Mindspark 21. Taking the legacy forward, this year too we are having a webinar series as a part of technical exhibition, and we hope to conduct a successful technical exhibition 5.0.
We hope all of you are doing well in these difficult times. The pandemic has affected all our lives in almost every aspect. We believe that every difficult situation is an opportunity for innovation, and here at Mindspark, we strive for the very same.
On this warm note, we are thrilled to welcome you all to the fourth webinar of the Tech Expo webinar series of the 15th edition of Mindspark.
We deem it an honor to have LIGO at Technical Exhibition 5.0's webinar series this year. LIGO stands for Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory. It is the world's largest gravitational wave observatory and a marvel of precision engineering. Today, we have one such individual from LIGO who is making his contribution in the field of gravitational waves. We are honored to have with us today Dr. Suresh Doravari from LIGO India. Dr. Suresh Doravari is an R&D Scientific and Technical Officer at Inter-University Center for Astronomy and Astrophysics, Ayuka, Pune, India.
Today, we are on the edge of a new frontier in astronomy, gravitational wave astronomy. Gravitational waves carry information on motions of the object in the universe. Since the universe was transparent to gravity moments after the Big Bang and long before light, gravitational waves will allow us to observe further back into the history of the universe than ever before.
Since gravitational waves are not absorbed or reflected by the matter in the rest of the universe, we will be able to see them in the form in which they were created. Moreover, we will effectively be able to see through objects between Earth and the gravitational wave source. Most importantly, gravitational waves hold the potential of unknown. Every time humans have opened new eyes on the universe, we have discovered something unexpected that revolutionized how we saw the universe and our place within it. Today, LIGO is helping us see the universe with a new set of eyes that do not depend on light.
LIGO consists of a unique set of detectors which opens a new window to the universe. Detection of gravitational waves and their electromagnetic counterparts have revolutionized astrophysics. One such detector, LIGO India, is planned to be built on the Indian soil to augment the global network of gravitational detectors. A brief introduction to how these extraordinary instruments work and the scientific and technological opportunities provided by LIGO India to the Indian students, academia, and industry would be highlighted in the following webinar. Thank you, sir, for taking time out of your busy schedule to address this session. Now, without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Suresh Doravri, sir, to take on our virtual dais and proceed with the webinar. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Yogeshwari and Srishti. That's a wonderful introduction to LIGO. Let us share my screen and proceed to the talk. I hope all of you can see my screen. So today I would be talking about the advanced LIGO detector, which is a second generation gravitational wave detector. We have two of such instruments, one at Hanford and one at Livingston in the USA. So what you see in front of you is the control room of LIGO Livingston. And you can see that there's a lot of information displayed in the control room on the walls. Basically, they reflect the state of the instrument, the state of the environment, especially earthquakes and storms in the vicinity. And on the left side, of course, you have the facility specific information, what's going on the observatory itself. And in front, facing the far wall, we have the critical parameters of the interferometer on display. On the people you see at, sitting in the control room, on the right side, you have the observatory like control station where we have one detector operator who is manning the detector in 3 shifts, 8-hour shifts. So while the detector runs, there is always a person in the control room. On the left side, in the foreground, you see a couple of guys who are hard at work. They are actually working on ensuring that the scientific data from the interferometer is in good condition. And on the far front line of the control room, you have what is called the commissioning team, who are always trying to see how best to improve the performance of the detector. So that's generally the layout of the control room, and it is the nerve center of the observatory. Yeah, so let's go to what are gravitational waves. So my talk is organized into 3 sections. First, I'll talk a little bit about how gravitational waves are generated and how they are detected. Then I will go into the details of the detector and how the various parts of the detector work. Since the audience today is largely engineering students, and anyone who is interested in the inner workings of the detector, the instrumentation, the engineering that goes into it, I'll spend a considerable amount of time talking about the various subsystems and how they work. And lastly, I will talk about the kind of opportunities that young students and college students have with both LIGO India and the nodal institutions of LIGO India and the laboratories across India, which are engaged in generating the technical skills and manpower required for LIGO India. So gravitational waves are generated in multiple ways. They are fluctuations of space-time which travel at the speed of light. Right from the Big Bang, there are gravitational waves generated. Let me see if I can pick up a pointer. Okay, so I have a laser pointer. So right from the start, during the Big Bang, there are gravitational waves generated, and these appear to us frozen in time as tiny changes in the polarization of the cosmic microwave background. There is a detector which has been built called ICEP, I think, which is measuring this. We are yet to see a result from that, but we hope to see it soon. A little faster than the very faster in the sense these gravitational waves occur as waves of different periodicity, and we are in the numbers here are frequency. So we're looking at extremely low frequency, meaning 10 to the minus 14 seconds, 10 to the minus 14 hertz. So it's a very long period, and that's why it appears frozen, almost frozen in time for us. Similarly, we have slightly higher frequency waves in the 10 to the minus 8 hertz to 10 to the minus 6 hertz, which are, orbiting supermassive black holes in a binary, supermassive binaries, which are at the centers of galaxies. These orbit each other very slowly, but they cause an enormous amount of amplitude in the gravitational waves generated. So they are visible to us. But to see them, we use an instrument which is a global array called the radio pulsar timing arrays, because they change the pulsar timing as the waves go past the pulsar. We at 10 to the minus 4 second hertz to 10 to the minus 2 seconds. In this regime, we have extreme mass ratio in spirals. These are compact binaries, like you would have stellar mass compact objects like neutron stars, black holes. These are in orbit, again in a binary form, and the inspiral and merger of these compact masses also generate gravitational waves. The ones which we have been detecting are of this kind, where we have compact binaries of black holes or neutron stars. Going forward, we also have other sources of gravitational waves at higher frequencies. Those are more esoteric. We will come to them. Today, I would like to focus on the terrestrial interferometers like LIGO, Virgo, and Kagra, and LIGO India in the future, which are designed to detect these compact binary in spiral merging. They also detect some of the background gravitational waves, which are like a gravitational wave background constant noise that occurs, accumulated over thousands of events. And those are called stochastic gravitational waves. All of that is presently being investigated. We have 50 odd detections of compact binaries. And as you have probably heard, this activity, the first detection of gravitational waves has been recognized by a Nobel Prize. So today, gravitational waves are one of the most exciting vanguard of astronomy and astrophysics research, because it has opened up a new window on the universe, which allows us to see things which we have never been able to see before. See in the sense not as a detection of light, but by detection of gravitational waves. Now, how exactly, what exactly do we mean by a merger, and how do black holes orbiting each other, how do they generate a space-time fluctuation? This particular video gives us an idea of how merging black holes behave. Here you see a space-time controllers. Okay, so I'll pause the video to explain what's going on here. You see an XY plane, a horizontal plane. Of course, space is three-dimensional. What we're showing you here is a two-dimensional representation of two orbiting black holes and how the space near them is curved by their gravitational presence. And as the black holes orbit, the space-time curvature changes in time. And eventually, when they merge, you will see that there is a ripple in space-time which propagates away from the merging black holes. That will happen right at the end. And you notice another thing. As they approach each other, the orbital frequency increases. In other words, they are orbiting each other faster and faster. And here comes the merger, and there it is. So this last, and then after merger, there is the ring down, which is what we saw. And these two, there is a pause in the simulation there, because the mathematics is hard to handle near the merger and ring down. So I think they have separated it. The event horizon of the two black holes touches and then becomes a single event horizon. Now you would also notice that the gravitational wave frequency increases, and this increase in frequency is called a chirp. It's like the chirp of a bird. And this is a very characteristic signal of the gravitational waves, which is what we try to detect in our detectors and distinguish it from other spurious noise that we detect in the detectors. So this is one of the characteristic signatures of the gravitational waves. Let's go to the next slide. After you reach this final point where you have here, so just around the merger, you would see that if you notice, there is a ripple that races away from the source. And that ripple is what propagates as a gravitational wave. Now let's look at what is the nature of this traveling wave. Is it like a normal wave that we see on water, or is it something different? So let's first look at the video and then I'll explain what we are looking at. As you can see, the wave is traveling from right to left, and this is a representation. If there were flexible, if space were having a kind of a grid, so that you can see the fluctuations of space-time, like a Cartesian graph, the distortions would appear as transverse in direction to the propagation direction. And the distortions have a characteristic stretching and compression in the plane perpendicular to the travel direction, the direction in which the wave travels. Now, if we focus our attention, let us say, on the second ellipse from the left, you would see that at one point it's a vertically stretched ellipse, and at another point it's a horizontally stretched ellipse. So this is a characteristic way in which space-time is stretched and compressed in the direction perpendicular to the direction of propagation. This particular signature is something that occurs along the equatorial plane of the orbiting binaries. In other directions, there can be a rotation of this ellipse. So to truly represent the full distortion of space-time, one requires to monitor two different directions of this ellipse. That is, you could have an ellipse which is stretched and compressed in this vertical and horizontal fashion. We call this the plus polarization. And then there could be one that is rotated with respect to this by 45 degrees. We call that a cross polarization. These are the two eigenvectors which we use to represent the one can represent the full polarization of a gravitational wave as a linear combination of the plus and the cross polarizations. So that's how we visualize a gravitational wave propagating through space. This compressing and expanding ellipse, which you saw in the previous video, is what enables us. We utilize that particular property of gravitational waves in detecting them, because it is stretching and compressing space. That is, it is stretching and compressing distances between objects. If the objects were free to move, they would follow the curvature of space. And that's what we try to recapture in an instrument which we call the Michelson interferometer. A Michelson interferometer has, especially the one used in LIGO, has suspended mirrors. There is a suspended beam splitter. This one, it's called beam splitter. And then there is a end test mass in the x direction, and there is an end test mass in the y direction. So these two test masses and the beam splitter are suspended such that they can move freely in the horizontal direction, horizontal to the ground. And let's look at what happens when a gravitational wave passes through such an interferometer. This shows light beams from the laser going. I'll again have to go back. Let me rewind a bit. So in a Michelson interferometer, we have a light beam from a laser which propagates and splits at the beam splitter, comes back, recombines, and if the mirror distances from the beam splitter are adjusted such that there is destructive interference going towards the right, that portion of the light disappears. It is destructive interference. So this particular property of the Michelson is fundamental to the way it works. So it's important to recognize that. Now, when the mirrors shake with respect to the beam splitter due to the passing gravitational wave, the light in the dark port, the dark port is the direction towards the right, which goes to the screen here, which is where you would put a detector to sense the change in the light intensity due to the passing gravitational wave. How exactly does that work? We have a light beam, which is a wave, this is a light wave, hits the end mirrors, returns, and recombines at the beam splitter to generate a destructive interference by design. We have adjusted it to be destructive because if the mirrors were repositioned, we could also have it bright here and dark in the other port. Right now, we have adjusted it such that the port towards the right is the dark port. Now, if you take a closer look at this, if the lengths of these arms were changed by the stretching and compression of space-time, the destructive interference condition that we have so carefully set up could be disturbed, and that's how you would get a flash of light in the dark port. And that's how we detect the gravitational waves using an interferometer. How much is this distortion of space? We can make a rough estimate of that using a formula. And this is calculated for roughly two masses, which are of the mass of the sun, which are at a distance of 15 megaparsecs in the Virgo cluster. The radius of the orbit of these two objects is about 20 kilometers. And the frequency of the orbital frequency is 400 hertz. That is, in 1/400th of a second, they would complete one orbit. Such a rapidly rotating pair of black holes would generate this quantity called h, which is the relative change in length of the distance between the beam splitter and the any of the mirrors by 10 to the minus 21. So if this distance were 1 meter, the amount by which the mirrors would move with respect to each other is 10 to the minus 21 meters. That's an extremely small quantity. It is way smaller than the diameter of a proton. So it's hard to detect this kind of a change in the arm length. And the entire technology of LIGO has been pushed to essentially detect this quantity. The design of the instrument, the technological advances we had to make, all of them are driven by this number. Before I get into, so the actual interferometer is more complicated than a simple Michelson. We use it in a configuration where we have things called power recycling, signal recycling, and we have a very high power laser. The arms of the Michelson are replaced by Fabry-Perot cavities. So all of this technology is something that I will get into shortly, so that we will examine the different parts of the interferometer and delve into why and how these things work. Before I do that, I can take a couple of questions regarding the portion of the generation of gravitational waves and the detection of and the propagation of gravitational waves, and the basic detection principle of a Michelson interferometer used for detecting gravitational waves. I can take one or two questions at this time, and then I'll continue into the details of the interferometer. How exactly do we take questions here? I don't see anything in the chat box.
So yes, we are going to ask you the questions from the live platform which we'll be getting.
Okay.
We're just checking the chat box there.
All right. Okay, shall we proceed?
So it looks like there are no questions on the platform yet because your information was very self-explanatory till this point.
Okay, no issues. So let me know if there is a question.
Yes, sure.
Okay, so now we will go into the way the interferometer works and its various parts. This is the advanced LIGO optical configuration. On the left side, we have a laser, which is called a pre-stabilized laser. Oops. This laser is, though it looks small here, is actually a full subsystem in its own right. It works at 1064 nanometers, 1064 nanometer wavelength of light. It's in the near infrared. It's invisible to the eye, which makes it especially more dangerous to work with it because it can very easily damage your eyes. The power of this laser, when it is injected into the interferometer, is about 125 watts in the full design, at full design capability. Right now, it is operating at a slightly lower power because we are trying to figure out how to handle the heat it generates in the interferometer. This laser is called a pre-stabilized laser. We will go into some details of that later. The entire chain, which is the laser, the input mode cleaner, is called the input optics. They are used for preparing the beam before it enters the interferometer. The interferometer proper starts at this mirror called the PRM, which is the power recycling mirror. And you notice here the beam splitter. That is the old beam splitter that I mentioned in a simple Michelson. This beam splitter splits the beam into two parts and two equal halves. The beams then propagate down into the arms, which are 4 kilometers long. And the arms have Fabry-Perot cavities. These are mirrors, again, suspended mirrors, which have very high reflectivity, and they bounce the light back and forth between them, increasing the effective length of the arm, multiplying by the number of bounces light goes through before it escapes. That's about like 100. So the 4 kilometer arm is in effect a 400 kilometer long arm. These two arms, when they're adjusted such that the dark port, which is towards the downward portion of the page here, if it is adjusted such that the dark port is really dark, then the light bounces back almost as if you had a retro reflection from a mirror. So the entire interferometer from the beam splitter to the arms forms an effective retroreflector. So the light which we shine into the interferometer bounces straight back at us. That light is recycled by the power recycling mirror to form a Fabry-Perot cavity of its own. This particular configuration of the detector is called a power recycled Fabry-Perot Michelson. The power recycled Fabry-Perot Michelson increases the input power from 125 watts to about 5.2 kilowatts because there is a power recycling gain in the power recycling cavity by about a factor of 40. So the effective laser beam that enters the interferometer is not just the 125 watts, but it's actually 5.2 kilowatts. This light, when it is incident, is further multiplied in the arms because the light is trapped in the arms by multiple bounces against the input test mass and the head test masses. And the total power which is trapped inside the cavity can rise to about 750 kilowatts. It's almost close to a megawatt of light. So there's an extremely, it can be very destructive if this light were to escape this cavity in a flash. So the interferometer is carefully built so that when there is such a flash that arises from the arms, when they go out of alignment, then that light is dumped very carefully into a beam dump rather than just land on the photodetector or something and blow it away. On the downward side, in the dark port, we have something called a signal recycling cavity, which is used to tune the bandwidth, the detection bandwidth of the detector, and for enhancing the signal that we wish to observe, which is the gravitational wave signal. So this is called resonant sideband extraction of the gravitational wave. At the very bottom, you see something called an output mode cleaner. The output mode cleaner is used to filter the light that comes out of the detector through the signal recycling mirror. And it allows only the interesting part of the light, which is the transverse electric mode 00, to pass through the detector and reach the photodiode. Because, as you can imagine, the dark port is dark. There is actually very little light here. However, all the imperfections in the detector that you had not intended do contribute light. So what comes into the dark port is a little bit of signal and a lot of noise. A lot of noise in terms of distorted light beams and so on. So what the output mode cleaner does is to filter all the unwanted light and pass only the gravitational wave channel into the photodetector. You can read all of this in this article in Classical and Quantum Gravity, volume 32. It's, I think, our detector paper. The modes of operation of a detector. As I was explaining, we have the simple Michelson. Then we have the Michelson with Fabry-Pérot arms. I'm just going through the various configurations of the detector to give you a flavor of how the modern interferometer is more complicated than a simple Michelson. Then we have the Michelson cavities, Michelson arms with Fabry-Pérot cavities, and the power recycling cavity. So you can see that the light power in the power recycling cavity has grown higher because of the power recycling mirror. And finally, we have power recycling and signal recycling, which gives us the full dual recycled Michelson Fabry-Pérot, dual recycled Fabry-Pérot Michelson interferometer. That is the configuration in which the modern interferometers are operated. What happens as a result of these successive, why do we go to this complicated optical configuration? You can see that this is what we call the sensitivity graph of the interferometer. It tells us the noise level in the interferometer and its capability to detect a signal. The red line is a simple Michelson. You can see the strain, the H quantity that it can detect is actually higher than 10 to the minus 21, which means you cannot see 10 to the minus 21. It's way below the sensitivity of the simple Michelson. When you have a Michelson with Fabry-Pérot arms, we get this kind of yellowish curve. And you can see that it has a very high noise at higher frequencies. And its a sensitive bucket is quite narrow, and it is in the domain of a few tens of hertz. If we have the Michelson with power recycling cavity, the amount of light trapped in the arms goes up significantly, and therefore the short noise of the light reaching the photodetector significantly drops. So at higher frequencies, the instrument becomes much more sensitive. And the most sensitive part, the bottom of the bucket, shifts from a few tens of hertz to 100 hertz or so. But still, as you can see, the detection band, if you say at 10 to the minus 23 level, the width of the detection band is still a few hundred hertz, maybe up to 300-400 hertz, starting from about a few tens of hertz. If you wanted to actually expand the range of frequencies that the detector can detect, we can use the signal recycling as an additional component in the dark port, And then you get this blue curve with its broad bucket, which can sense gravitational waves all the way to a few kilohertz, starting from a few tens of hertz. So that's the reason why we use this optical configuration of a dual recycled fabric or Michelson interferometer. Let's go into subsystems. Now I'm going to speed up a little bit because we have to keep time. The various subsystems advanced, it's a complicated instrument. So we divide it into little parts and we try to understand each part separately. Actually, the expertise required for these various subsystems is slightly different. So different groups of people work on these subsystems. As you know, LIGO is a global organization. So we have more than 40, 50 universities, people working all over the world in developing the technology required for these various subsystems. For example, the pre-stabilized laser was largely developed in Germany in Albert Einstein Institute at Hanover. And they continue to be at the forefront of new laser development. The input mode cleaner is used for, it's once again a suspended triangular cavity. As the light passes through it, the input mode cleaner locks onto the TEM00 mode and allows, it rejects all the other modes. It also stabilizes the pointing and the intensity of the input laser, so that the light reaching the interferometer, starting at the power recycling mirror, is stable and clean. We will look at what actually happens in these subsystems as we go along. Similarly, we have various other subsystems for example, seismic isolation, for protecting the mirrors, the suspended mirrors from motion of the ground. We have suspensions which act together with the seismic isolation to further reduce the jitter in the mirrors to less than a femtometer. As I mentioned, the amount of light power that is trapped inside these arms is almost a megawatt. So even if you absorb, a fraction of a millionth of a light, you would still get a watt of light absorbed on these mirrors. That over time tends to distort these mirrors. And that distortion destroys the very carefully set up optical configuration. That's the reason why we have a thermal compensation system which recurves the mirrors by actively heating them with a carbon dioxide laser, so that the curvature of the mirrors is corrected as the interferometer gets hot due to the light that is trapped inside. The arms, which are 4 kilometers long, require certain initial stabilization in order to bring them to the condition where they become resonant with the incident light. That system is called the arm length stabilization. We use a nonlinear process for doubling the 1064 nanometer lights frequency to so that it has a wavelength of 532 nanometers. And that green light, from infrared, when you increase its frequency, it becomes green. And the green light is used as a length sensing scheme for sensing the length of the, sensing the distance between the two mirrors, and stabilize that length, the length of this optical cavity, before we can hand off the controls to the infrared light. So all these various subsystems have to work together. And so there is something called a global control system for, so on this bottom left-hand side, I've got a box which talks about length sensing and control, angular sensing and control, physical environment monitoring. All of these things are tied together through a control and data acquisition system called CDS. CDS is a system that is developed in-house within the LIGO community, and it's very powerful for the task that we need to get done in LIGO. What stops us from making progress? In order to, it's a battle that we wage every day to reduce the noise in the interferometer. What generates this noise is what governs the various subsystems and the focus of those subsystems in addressing and minimizing the noise sources which disturb the interferometer. On the top, you have what's called the seismic vibrations, the ground vibrations, which occur due to distant earthquakes, due to sea waves crashing on the shores. All of them move the ground slightly. We do not see them, of course, in our daily lives, but the interferometer essentially can stop working if there is an earthquake even thousands of kilometers away, because the ground shakes. And that shaking ground will move the mirrors and make it impossible for us to measure the gravitational waves. In order to protect ourselves, we have a seismic isolation system which acts as a kind of a low-pass filter, which doesn't allow the ground vibrations to reach the mirrors. Now, between the two mirrors in the long 4-kilometer arms, all of these mirrors are suspended in vacuum so that air fluctuations do not disturb the light passing in between the mirrors. However, the very tiny amount of gas, we operate at something called 10 to the minus 9 torr, which is 10 to the minus 12 times lower than an atmosphere. So there's very few atoms. The density of this gas is very low within the vacuum chamber. Nevertheless, the residual gas has random refractive index fluctuations, which can cause a fluctuation in the phase of the light which is passing through the gas in between the mirrors. This is a source of noise, but the vacuum tubes are maintained at such a low vacuum that this is not a dominant source of noise, but it can get worse if the vacuum is compromised. We have Brownian motion of the mirrors because they are all operating at room temperature, and the energy that is absorbed by the mirror from its environment tends to vibrate the surface of the mirror. These inherent vibrations are called thermal noise, and these thermodynamic mirror surface fluctuations are a significant source of noise even today in LIGO, because the optical coatings that are used in LIGO necessarily they have a very tiny amount of absorbance, about a few parts per million, and that is generating a significant amount of thermal noise on the mirror coatings. This is an ongoing topic of research today, and it's a limiting noise source. Similarly, there are other sources of noise in the detector, and we will go on to them very soon. I need to switch tools. Yeah. When we say limiting noise sources, we tend to plot the contribution of various noise sources and evaluate something called a noise budget. This noise budget is a fundamental tool that we use in LIGO to determine what should be our focus when we say, okay, I need to work on something to improve the detector. How do we do it? We have to identify dominant noise sources and figure out what is causing them and try to reduce them. This is an activity. This is what drives the instrumentation, the physics research within LIGO. So identifying the limiting noise sources, limiting our sensitivity, and find ways to reduce them. That is the core of our activity. This is a picture of the pre-stabilized laser. It is inside a clean room, which is in itself inside another clean room. This is a class 100 clean room. There are only 100 particles per cc of air, of dust particles. So it's a very clean room. To enter this area, you need to maintain strict clean room protocols. The reason is, of course, if there is a little dust particle which sits on any of these mirrors, light landing on that dust particle will be absorbed, and given the light power, it can easily get hot and burn the mirror. For this laser to operate, you need to operate most of LIGO work. Any of the LIGO optics have to be maintained extremely dust-free. The pre-stabilized laser has a complicated structure. It has an initial NPRO. NPRO is a non-planar ring oscillator laser. which is at 1064 nanometers. It's a ND YAG laser, neodymium YAG laser. And this laser generates about 2 watts of light. That 2 watts of light is amplified in successive amplifiers. First, we have a medium power amplifier, which pushes it up to about 35 watts. Then we have a high power oscillator, which pushes it up to about 120, 140 watts. Now, at the moment, this high power oscillator has been giving us a lot of trouble, so it has been replaced by a second medium power amplifier, and currently the LIGO system operates at about 60 to 70 watts till we figure out how to get around this problem. Then we have something called a pre-mode cleaner. This mode cleaner once again does what the other input mode cleaner does, but in a smaller scale. These are all a tabletop. This is not a suspended instrument. It's a rigid cavity. It sits on a tabletop. And its role is very similar. It locks on to the TEM00 mode before it passes the 140 watt light into the input mode cleaner, which is a suspended object. You can see that there is a number of feedback loops. There's the power stabilization loop. There are actually 2 power stabilization loops, the inner power stabilization loop and the outer power stabilization loop. And then there is a frequency stabilization. By locking the laser, frequency stabilization is a complicated topic because frequency and length are related. So the reference cavity here is a first length reference. It's a rigid cavity, and the reference cavity is used to stabilize the frequency of the NPRO at low frequencies. The higher frequencies, the laser light is stabilized using the input mode cleaner as a length reference. Subsequently, in a kind of a bootstrap mechanism, the high frequency the low frequency reference is handed off to the common mode arm length of the 2 arms as in a kind of a breathing mode where the arms expand and contract. The laser follows the length change of the 2 arms. A fundamental technique that is used, I've been talking about, sensing length of the arms because the stretching and contraction of space is essentially detected as a length change of the arms of the micas. This length change is detected through a fundamental technique called the Pound-Drever-Hall technique. There's an excellent paper by Eric Black, which you can find in arXiv. It talks about how to detect a length change. It's I don't want to get into the details of this, but it is capable of detecting easily, say, a picometer of length change in a broad range of frequencies. It's a workhorse that is used across the entire laser community. For locking any laser to a cavity, we use a Pound-Drever-Hall technique. The suspensions in LIGO are complicated piece. The suspended mirror actually is suspended from a pendulum. It's a multi-stage pendulum. Typically, any of the main mirrors of the LIGO are suspended in a quad pendulum. It's a 4-stage pendulum, with the upper 2 stages being metallic and the lowest 2, the penultimate one and the final one, are made of quartz glass, silica. The reason why, and the fibers which are used to the fibers that are used to suspend, the upper stages are suspended with steel wires, whereas the lower stage actually uses glass fibers. The reason why we do that is because we want to reduce the thermal noise of the suspension itself, which would contribute to shaking of the mirrors. We can go into the technology of how these glass fibers are drawn and how they're attached to other mirrors, etc. All of that was a technology that was developed within the LIGO community over the decades of research that was necessary to suppress the suspensions, the noise from the suspensions being the dominant noise source. The suspensions, why do we require a quad suspension? When we look at what we call a transfer function of how vibrations propagate from the ground into the mirror, we see that the more suspensions, more stages of a suspension there are, the better it is for this kind of a low pass filter that we generate. If we had just one stage, we would get a suppression of 1 over frequency squared. If we had each successive stage gives you one more of the 1 over f squared dependence. And eventually with 4 stages, you get 1 over f to the 8. In other words, if you had the suspensions at about 1 Hertz in resonance frequency of the suspension, roughly around 1 Hertz, by about 100 Hertz, if the ground shakes at 100 Hertz frequency, that particular amplitude of that wave would be suppressed by 100 raised to the 8, so 10 to the 10. No, that's 10 to the 16. Yeah. Seismic isolation system is essentially tasked with this suppression of the ground vibration. So the suspensions sit on top of the seismic isolation. The seismic isolation is has to, you have to support the mirror which is sitting inside the vacuum chamber. There are 2 kinds of vacuum chamber, but we'll focus on one just now. So we have an external hydraulic seismic isolator and an internal seismic isolator. The vacuum chambers envelop the internal seismic isolator, and the support structure passes from the exterior of the vacuum chamber to the interior through a carefully designed system which isolates the vacuum chamber. So the vacuum chamber itself does not touch the mirrors directly. So the exterior seismic isolator supports the interior seismic isolator. The exterior one is called the HEPI, hydraulic external pre-isolator, and the interior one is called the ISI, internal seismic isolator. They work pretty similarly to that of suspensions. They're all oscillators of some kind. So they provide, with every oscillator that you add in tandem, you get a 1 over f squared suppression. I will come to the suspension performance. They're roughly in the frequencies band of about 10 to 100 Hertz. The suppression of the ground vibrations is by a factor of 1000. So if the ground is shaking by about a micron per square per root Hertz, the displacement within the chamber is reduced to, well, here it is 10 to the minus 9 as the ground at 10 to 100 Hertz. And within the chamber, it is less than a picometer. The core optics, which are the main optics of the LIGO detector, are once again a marvel of research, because they are about 40 centimeters in diameter, but the surface is finished to better than a nanometer in precision from the ideal surface curvature that we would like. These are slightly curved mirrors, almost flat. And the coatings are once again extraordinary. They have an extremely low loss and very tightly controlled reflectivities that we would like at both the first harmonic, that is 1064 nanometers, as well as the doubled light at 532. So in this introduction, what I have mentioned now is that there is a overlap of multiple technologies within LIGO, which give rise to a very exciting multidisciplinary field where almost everybody has something to contribute. Whether you come from the optics or electronics or mechanics background, you can contribute to LIGO. And typically, all of us have multiple skills slightly outside our domain of basic expertise, because we have to work with groups in a coordinated fashion, understanding the constraints coming from multiple technologies. as I spoke to you about control and data acquisition systems, the length control and angular control of LIGO are both local control systems as well as global control systems. So when I say local, I'm talking about how a mirror or a seismic isolator or a laser is stabilized in itself locally. And it also has to, you also have to stabilize the distance between two mirrors, which are 4 kilometers apart. So we have both local control systems and global control systems. LIGO is a huge control system problem. Very highly coupled nested control loops are everywhere in LIGO. So we have hundreds of control loops, which we simultaneously manage at the cutting edge noise performance of each of those. So we have both, as I was saying, length control as well as angular controls. Both sensing the length and sensing the angle are also a difficult problem in LIGO. Most of our control loops are limited by the noise in our sensors. So we are constantly trying to work at improving the noise, reducing the noise in the sensors in order to provide a more stable control. The architecture is mostly digital now, in the sense that we collect the signals and then we process it within a digital control system, and then we feed the control signals back into the analog world. The digital processing is we work on the control filters and the decoupling, the cross-coupling between various loops is an ongoing topic which is of constant concern to LIGO. Modeling the interferometer and understanding what is going on within the optical plant, because we have multiple optically coupled cavities. So managing one Fabry-Perot cavity is relatively simple. Managing multiple Fabry-Perot cavities which are exchanging light becomes very complicated to understand and easily mathematically model. So we have developed computational tools within the LIGO community. Finesse is one of them. It is widely used for modeling the interferometer and understanding its optical response to fluctuations that land upon the interferometer. Finesse is a workhorse which we regularly use to understand the detector and understand how to sense the various parts of the detector, how to sense the lengths and the angles. And then we develop our noise budgets, and then finally land at where we should focus our attention in order to build a better detector. The control and data acquisition system is once again, as I said, proprietary to LIGO because of the kind of precision over long distances that we need to maintain. It has an excellent timing system which maintains synchronicity over 4 kilometers in one direction and 4 kilometers in the other. And it allows us to shut down portions of the detector independent of others, in the sense that if you wanted to change something, you don't need to shut down the entire control system. You can shut down parts of it and restart it, which is a technique that was developed within the LIGO community. What happens in the future? We have already put in place plans which are seriously being discussed now as to what we wish to do as a next generation detector. At the moment, we are shortly going to enter into a phase of upgrading the detectors from Advanced LIGO to Advanced LIGO Plus. It's called the A Plus design, which will enhance our sensitivity in the bucket by about a factor of 3 to 5. And further, we are going beyond that. We have other telescopes, other detectors that are coming up, called the Einstein Telescope and the Cosmic Explorer. These are, at the moment, communities are discussing how to build them, what are the driving factors which we wish to address. And those have almost a factor of 10 better, a factor of 100 better in sensitivity compared to Advanced LIGO. So we have a long-ranging roadmap for future detectors, and all of these detectors require a very focused development of technology. Not all the technology that we require for these detectors is not currently available. So we have plans. We require. We know which technologies we need to focus on. So our requirements are carefully charted out, and the maturity of each of these fields is marked, so that we know where we have to focus our attention and how to push the various domains of our technology to reach the maturity we require at a given time. You can see the roadmap and the basic references in these sources. The Instrument Science White Paper of 2020 is a good source. You also can go to the Gravitational Wave International Committee website. There you have like decadal plans and future directions. It allows you to identify areas of research which may be of interest to you, because it takes years to develop the know-how and be able to contribute to LIGO. So knowing what's coming up in the future is a good way to chart your own growth. Let's talk about LIGO India a little bit. LIGO India has 4 nodal institutions, which together are planning to build LIGO India. We have the in-principle approval from the Prime Minister to go ahead. So certain amount of seed money has been provided, with which we have identified a site, and we have started prototyping and testing facilities. We are actively, of course, working with the LIGO laboratory in the United States, because this detector has is almost identical to the detectors in the US. It's a Indo-US collaboration, and the 4 nodal institutions, RRCAT, IPR, TCSCM, and IUCAA, have different competencies which complement each other, and we together come to divide the whole task among ourselves and move towards forming a single team which will execute the job. One of the hardest parts is actually build the human power, the manpower required to execute this job. So we have within the LIGO India a multi-stage training program. We have something to engage undergrads, school students, in our own in-house personnel, as well as fresh observatory personnel who join us. So they go through a kind of a training program that teaches them the physics and the engineering that goes into LIGO. Then there's a level 2 detector training program, which so we try to separate out the basic sciences from the engineering aspects, basically because when I say engineering, I mean to say the technology that is used within the LIGO community, as opposed to technology that is more widely spread within the community. So the reason why we separate these two things is, if you plan to work within LIGO, then you require a certain set of tools which are necessary for that. But if you are generally interested in the science of LIGO, you don't need to worry about exactly what is used, but you can use any general, like for example, you can use a control and data acquisition system, which is not specific to LIGO, but you can still understand LIGO using you can build some training modules to do that. So we have been doing that, and then after we pass through these 2 stages, a person who wishes to work within LIGO community would need to spend some time on some of the prototypes. We have a multitude of prototypes spread out across the world. They are like 1/100th the scale of a full-scale interferometer, but they have all the functionality. So we use that for both technology development, new technology development, as well as for training our personnel. And then, of course, one would require to spend some time on the observatory, because it is both a technologically challenging thing to understand how an object which is 100 times bigger works. It also is a culture working in small groups is quite different from working in large groups, because working in large groups comes with a overhead of coordination and being aware of work that goes on all across the interferometer. So you need to work with a high degree of coordination. It almost runs like a battleship with its own command structure and a very tightly coordinated activity. At the same time, a great deal of creativity is also necessary. So these are kind of, it's a creative tension between those who wish to improve the detector, which is the commissioning team, and those who wish to run the detector in a steady state, which is the operations team. So we have a kind of synergy between these two groups on the site, and it is necessary to understand the culture of how an observatory runs. So it's very important to spend time on the observatory before you can actually work on a LIGO India commissioning. Within IUCA, we have multiple modules, training modules, which have been developed over the past couple of years. We have suspensions, seismic isolation, laser stabilization, and we can go into details of each of them if some of you are interested. Typically, a suspension or a seismic isolator requires us to have an idea of how the mechanical design is done and how from a mechanical point of view, there is a certain amount of stuff you need to understand. But also from a control system point of view, you need to understand how this structure responds to an input gravity, the input ground noise. So we often compute what are called transfer functions of the suspension. And then in the control system language, we call it plant identification. We need to have a way to identify the frequency response of this plant. So we have a multitude of sensors, which we develop in the course of our work in order to sense the motion of the mirror with respect to the frame of the suspension, as well as sense the ground motion at a great wide range of frequencies, starting from microseismic frequencies at 0.1 hertz, right up to the human activity at a few hundred hertz. So seismic sensing and operating the detector at low frequencies is a very active zone of research. Laser stabilization and developing new lasers, more powerful lasers with a very stable frequency and intensity is an ongoing topic of research as well. As I said, LIGO has its own culture. It has its own tools that we use, both in data acquisition as well as in control architecture. So we have a mock control room in IUCA, which has been recently set up, in which one can immerse oneself in the control room environment of LIGO and pick up the skills you need to work in that environment. At RRCAT, there is a very large facility that is being built to train our in-house personnel and develop the human resources that are necessary to build LIGO India. They have a full-scale 10-meter interferometer that is coming up shortly, and they also have training modules of the vacuum chambers that were built by IPR, one of our nodal institutions in Ahmedabad. And these facilities are being set up such that both our in-house personnel as well as researchers who are interested in participating in the LIGO technology development would be able to experience a real-life interferometer. Our research opportunities are usually summarized in this webpage maintained by IUCA, where we have multiple opportunities for both summer school students as well as internship students, final year master's thesis or bachelor's thesis students. In addition to researchers who would like to interface with us for postdoctoral positions or graduate studentships, so please check back with this site as often as you can. This is the LIGO site. You can see the corner station digital GPS monument. So we have surveyed the site and we have placed monuments everywhere, which are precisely positioned, which is the first thing you would do to develop the site. So we hope to see the site come online very shortly. So we're waiting at this time for the government to give us formal approval to proceed. Thank you. I can take any questions now if you like.
Yes, sir. We thank you, sir, for joining us today. We would now take questions from the audience. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask them through the chat box.
There was one question previously put in the chat box. Can you please explain what do you mean by when you said that the event horizon and distortions of the orbiting black holes merge more briefly?
Let me see if I can get back to that slide. As you know, black holes have what is called an event horizon. Event horizon is the final surface, which if you cross, you cannot get out of the black hole. Not even light can get out of the black hole once you cross the event, once light crosses the event horizon. Was it here? This one. Here, right? Yeah, this one, right? So here you can see that the black holes would merge, and I mean, if the question arises as to what happens to black holes when they merge, we of course do not precisely know. We don't know what goes on inside the event horizon because no information comes out. But we can model what happens just before that event occurs. And after the event occurs, we know that there is a larger black hole that remains, which is a combination of the first two. One of the things you would notice if you see our presently detected gravitational events is that if you have initial masses of M1 and M2, when they merge, you have some mass which is M3, which is not quite equal to M1 plus M2. It is a bit lesser than M1 plus M2 because in the event, it's an extremely cataclysmic event, one of the most energetic events we have observed in nature. So in such an event, energy is radiated away, and several solar masses of energy is radiated in a flash of a second. So it's a very violent event. So the merging of two black holes essentially fuses their event horizons into a single black hole and a single event horizon. Hope that answers your question.
So, the next question is, if a gravitational wave stretches the distance between the LIGO mirrors, doesn't it also stretch the wavelength of the laser light?
That's a very good question. The laser light is, the frequency of the gravitational waves that we are observing is about a few hundred hertz. That is the sensitivity of LIGO. While the light transit time between the mirrors is far shorter than that. So if you take any particular packet of light waves, they would transit the detector long before the gravitational wave that you're trying to observe. So we are not looking at the same wave when we say, okay, at any, it's like we're taking a series of snapshots of the detector with a flash of light. So the light doesn't expand within the observation time of the gravitational wave that you're trying to observe.
So, one of the next questions is, what spin-off technologies or other indirect benefits have come from the LIGO instrument research?
Yes. It is LIGO, as you can imagine, is a pure science experiment. We push boundaries of known technology in multiple directions for a pure science objective. We are not trying to actually develop any applied physics or applied technology through this. However, I do get the point of the question. But what I'm trying to impress is, we cannot always predict the consequences of the technology we develop in the years to come. So we do not have a direct link between what we are doing today to what happens in the future. But even with that said, I can point out a few applications that have risen directly from LIGO. One of them is our extraordinary control systems and the software that we generate. Much of it is open source, so people can access this technology and incorporate it in their present-day applications. The seismic sensors that we have developed have been commercialized. They have been used in undersea cable laying machines where we have to sense the seafloor. They have been used to detect ground motion in drilling for oil. So the ground sensing, the ability to sense the ground motion, has contributed in multiple ways. The technology for polishing mirrors of very large diameters to an extremely high precision is again a niche technology that very few countries have. And that drives the entire optics industry to new heights. Even the ability to measure a mirror curvature at the level of a nanometer is a challenging task. So metrology, ability to measure displacements, ability to measure surface deformations is once again a technology that is driven by LIGO and similar experiments. Lasers, the development of a 1064 nanometer laser of a sufficient frequency and intensity stability has also driven the laser field at very high powers, 200 watts of light at extremely stable powers. So the seismic isolators we develop once again have driven a multitude of industries to realize the importance of how to build seismic isolators in fairly compact dimensions. LIGO and Virgo differ in their seismic isolation philosophies. Virgo builds 9-meter tall towers for seismic isolation, very effective. LIGO has chosen to take another route. They build a compact, they are just 2-3 meters tall seismic isolators, which give a comparable performance, especially at mid to high frequencies. At low frequencies, Virgo still performs better than LIGO. So yeah, there are a multitude of technologies we drive, and the ramifications of that slowly percolate through society. And it's, pure sciences drive research 20, 30 years down the line. It's not, the returns on investment are not immediate. You see it down the line in decades to come.
Sir, the next question is, wouldn't the temperature and pressure change the properties of the springs for the suspension of the mirrors over time?
The pressure fluctuations are not very relevant because we maintain the vacuum system at 10 to the minus 9 torr. So the density of air inside the vacuum system doesn't change very much. However, the pressure fluctuations outside the vacuum chamber, like let us say there's a thunderclap or there's a passing airplane or there's a thunderstorm nearby, those pressure fluctuations do ring up the vacuum chamber itself, and that vibration penetrates into the vacuum system, not through the pressure wave, but through a mechanical coupling. Temperature, though, is a dominant driver in LIGO. Yes, when the room temperature changes, for example, the springs do tend to expand and the mirrors tend to move up and down. But we maintain the entire corner station and the end stations of LIGO. I think the temperature stability required is plus or minus 1/4 of a degree centigrade. So plus minus 0.25 degrees. It is much more demanding than a normal air conditioner, which typically has a plus minus 1 degree kind of a precision. And LIGO operates in a plus minus 0.25 degrees. Even that is not sufficient, and we often have to tune up our detectors for seasonal variations. US gets pretty cold in winter. So summer to winter variations require us to retune the mirror suspension sometimes.
So the next question is the LIGO experiment able to detect the earthquakes? And if it is possible, can we have some data or some pictures about it?
LIGO, of course, is sensitive to the earthquakes in the sense that if there is a large earthquake, the mirrors shake so much that we cannot operate the detector. Earthquakes typically, a typical seismometer generally senses frequencies at a higher frequency than what LIGO typically worries about. LIGO is more affected by low frequency vibrations of the ground. Because of the seismic isolator and the suspensions acting as a low pass filter, pretty much anything above a few hertz is heavily attenuated within the LIGO system. So we are not sensitive to high frequency vibrations. But it is the low frequency kind of slowly moving hills of the ground which affect us more. The data of this, of course, is documented in Google. You just have to Google it and you will get the data. Data in the sense, of course, you don't get real seismometer data because often that is tightly controlled by law in India. In the US, they're much more open about the data. So there are published power spectral densities and the kind of motion that bothers LIGO in the seismic isolator papers in LIGO. I think I showed you one, right? Yeah, here it is. This is, see, the blue curve is the power spectral density of the ground motion. And about 0.1 hertz, you see this peak, that's the microseismic peak, which is saying that the ground is moving at about 10 to the minus 6 meters per root hertz. So it's moving about a micron. And that is very troublesome for LIGO. As you can see, our seismic isolator has not been very effective in attenuating that motion. ISI is the internal seismic isolator. The motion of the top of the platform is not any better than the ground motion. Our ability to suppress low frequency oscillations of the ground is far poorer than our ability to attenuate the high frequencies. High frequencies have been attenuated by a factor of 1,000. So it's the low frequencies that bother us. High frequencies, we have already taken care of.
Okay, sir. One last question from my side. What are the internship and research opportunities at LIGO, and how can we work at LIGO?
There are multiple ways you can approach LIGO. You can directly write to the, there is an international LIGO SURF program at LIGO Labs in the USA. Typically, they take in about 5 or 6 Indian students every year for both data analysis, theoretical analysis, as well as instrumentation. You can write to them directly, and there is a application. Probably it is open right now. Secondly, Australia has Future Talent Travel Awards, which attract undergrad students every year. We ourselves at IUCA offer internships and projects for college students. Then there will be in the future, once the project is up and running, we would have many more opportunities for people to work with us both in our own laboratories as well as in other research laboratories which engage in similar research as gravitational wave technology development.
Thank you, sir, for answering all of our questions. This brings us to the end of our event. We hope that this webinar helped you learn something new today. We express our heartfelt gratitude to Dr. Suresh Doraveri, sir, for gracing MindSpark 21 with his eminent presence.
We would also like to thank Dr. B.B. Ahuja, Director of College of Engineering, Pune, Dr. M.S. Sutavne, Deputy Director, College of Engineering, Pune, Dr. P.R. Dhamangaonkar, Associate Dean, Student Affairs of College of Engineering, Pune, and Dr. Mrs. Aarti Petkar, Faculty Advisor, MindSpark, for their valuable guidance.
We would also like to express our gratitude towards Digital India, AICTE, and UNESCO for their support as patronage for MindSpark 21, and we are looking forward for their continued support. I would also like to thank the audience for engaging with us today. We would once again like to thank Dr. Suresh Doraveri, sir, for his esteemed presence. Thank you very much.
We
Thank
look
you.
forward. We look forward for seeing all of you in the future events and experience the thrilling ride of MindSpark 21. And join us to
Thank you.
realize the.
I'm sorry. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. It's been a wonderful experience, and I hope to see more of you engaging in LIGO India specific research in the future. Thank you.
Stay tuned for the next episodes on our social media handles, and I would like to invite you to explore Tech Expo platform.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.